Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Indegene Digital Summit. My name is Sameer Lal, and I head the medical business at Indegene, and I'm speaking to you from London in the UK. Today's session is titled Delivering the Gap Between Aspirations to Actuality as we work towards a high customer experience for our customers. Our session will focus on medical affairs and, more importantly, the role they are playing in driving customer centricity, especially around digital transformation. We'll talk about benchmarks of how other companies are doing it well, but more importantly, have our experts provide a flavor of how they are trying to do that in their individual companies. Before we start, it'll be my pleasure to introduce the panel to you. I'm joined with me, Mary Alice Dwyer. She's the VP of Synetic Life Sciences, and she also heads the Medical Affairs Digital Strategy Council for us. And we'll talk more about the council shortly. Maureen Feeney, she's a VP of Medical and Scientific Communications at Takeda. Hi, Maureen. Abhijit Barve, Chief Medical Officer at Viatris. And finally, my colleague Kay Utek, VP of Strategic Initiatives. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for your time. Before we start, I do want to highlight the critical role the Medical Affairs Digital Strategy Council has been playing for the better part of the last 2 years in driving digital transformation in medical affairs. And a key part of that has been the white papers they've released. And one of them came out a few weeks back, which has been the central tenet around the benchmarking that we'll talk about in our conversation shortly. And in your chat window, you will get to see a link if you have not read the white paper yet. And that white paper was based on key pieces of study which was brought about by our colleagues in DT Consulting, which did a lot of that work on the commercial side, and we extrapolated it on the medical side. Before we start with the panel discussion, May Alice, I thought it would be a good way perhaps for the audience to get a sense of the 12 capabilities that we studied, and more importantly, what we call as the DX scores. May Alice?
Absolutely. Well, hello, everyone. We wanted to do the digital assessment of maturity within medical affairs. We identified 12 capabilities where digital processes and activities are employed. And these capabilities included things like the field medical interactive content, which we'll dive into a little bit more in our discussion today, virtual events, multi-channel and omni-channel strategies, field medical remote interactions, CRM tools, mobile apps, medical information and medical websites, customer engagement analytics and insights, and contact centers, as well as touchpoint integration. So we looked at these sort of core deliverables that medical affairs has, and then evaluated where these capabilities have been implemented. For those companies who've implemented these particular best practices, they then answered a series of questions about best practices that were aligned to that particular capability. And it was from that assessment that a DX score was able to be calculated. So from those companies who were who are using that capability, and then identifying which best practice they had also implemented. So we were able, through this calculation, to get an idea of how far along each company was in implementing best practices to deliver this capability. So we're going to dive into a few of those today and better understand where we're doing well and the opportunity to further advance. But before we, I think, dive into those specifics, I did also want to share one of the key outcomes, I think, assessments of those companies that participated in the survey. And that was that 67% of those respondents thought that their organization had ambitious digital plans, but 47% of them were somewhat satisfied with that progress. So I think what that says is, although a lot of companies are implementing digital practices, there's still a lot to do. And there's a anxiousness maybe to go a little bit faster. So I think it'll be interesting to dive into some of the specifics so we can get an idea of what medical affairs is doing and what they hope to still implement. Back to you, Samir. Okay.
Thank you, Mary Alice. And it was interesting over the course of the last 1-2 years, Mary Alice and I have been privy to quite a bit of foundational changes on medical affairs organizations. And obviously, the events of the pandemic have delivered 5 years of change management in 10 months' time, right? So that's really accelerated the whole transformation journey. We've seen the evolution of chief digital officers, and a lot of those chief digital officers are actually coming from outside pharma. We've seen the elevation of chief medical officers into chief digital officers in some organizations. We've seen an increasing openness on medical affairs organizations to take outside perspective. We have one of our panel members or council members take somebody from a digital agency as part of their team because they felt, all of us know medical, but I'm not sure all of us understand digital. Why not get somebody from outside in, right? So very, very good harbingers of change, so to speak, right? Everybody's trying to do different things, all for a better customer experience. So with that, Mary Alice, if you're okay, let's double click on first of our capabilities. Like Mary Alice, there were 12 that we covered in the survey. There's no way we'll do justice to all of them in today's session. So we cherry picked 3. Let's start with the first one, which was around field medical. And once again, the role of field medical really became center point because of the pandemic, where increasingly we found that HCPs were more willing to engage with the field medical than our colleagues on the commercial side, pretty much highlighting the important role medical affairs is playing. So before we hand over to the panelists, perhaps Kate, you can provide an overview on the key findings around field medical, please.
Absolutely. Thanks, Samir. With the field medical piece, as Samir said, we really tried to focus in on just a few capabilities here so that we could discuss them in much greater detail. The first one we're going to look at is field medical interactive content. And this dealt with, materials where, as the MSL interacted with the healthcare professional, those materials provided different outcomes based on the types of responses that were received from the healthcare professional. And this was actually one of our higher DX scores that we received in the feedback from the companies. However, only a third of the companies that were surveyed actually have implemented this capability as part of their overall digital capabilities. So that's only 5 of the 15 companies that were surveyed. Now, in addition to that, another 6 companies say that they have this in their plans to actually create content that is interactive for the medical science liaisons to utilize out in the field with healthcare professionals. So of the overall best practices that were identified for the delivery of interactive field medical content, this capability had a DX score of 60. And Mary Alice, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit more in detail about what those best practices are, maybe the ones that were of greatest use to companies and maybe those that were areas for development.
Of course, thanks, Kay. Yeah, I think, of the 5 companies that have implemented interactive electronic content, there's a wide range of the best practices that they have been able to implement versus those that they're still striving for. So on the end where of those companies, again, only the companies who have implemented interactive electronic content would have answered the questions around best practices. But pretty consistently, all were creating and managing content, collecting input and feeding back, getting feedback from the MSLs to optimize that content, and even really having targeted sessions to define content objectives based on HCP needs. So those really rose to the top as consistently implemented best practices. On the opposite end, though, where companies are still striving to implement maybe some of the more challenging best practices, many fewer had implemented those. And those were best practices such as being able to change the course of a discussion and the sequence of information that was used because of the dialogue and the feedback you're getting in the moment from the healthcare provider. Also, I think really the ability to ensure that the right data is captured from the interactive electronic tool. And, at the same time as being responsive, you're capturing information in what screens are used, what content is most often referred to. So again, you see, I think, a continuum of best practices that have been implemented as teams are utilizing this capability, and those that they're still striving for as it becomes more embedded in what they do. So Samir, maybe we want to get some live feedback from our guests as well.
Absolutely, Maya, that's right. So Maureen and Abhijit, we now lean on you. Maureen, perhaps you first from a US perspective, and then Abhijit, I'll look at you for a global view. But Maureen, if you don't want to react to some of the best practices, what you heard about, and then the overarching view from Kay as well, please.
Yeah, no, thanks, Samir. Thanks, Mary Alice, for kind of those insights. And Kay, I think they're spot on, right? These are the challenges that we all face, and we're all in a continuum. And as we were speaking, in our prep discussions about best practices, some of us are in our infancy with dreams of going to Harvard, and we're not quite there yet. And I would say that that's really the challenge, I think, from a U.S. perspective, is how do we meet our customer where they are, and implement some of these upscaled practices around content, but then get the information back that actually helps us gather better insights. And I think that's a big ask of a lot of content. And some of the best practices that we've started to embark on is really starting this more navigatable content, and how can we then make this part, and we'll get to this a little bit later, part of our future state ecosystem on how we interact, no matter where you're at. If you're in the field having an interaction, it's the same interactive content that they can continue their journey if they come back online into our medical web portal. And really, how do we build out content that then answers their questions, helps educate and close gaps, and then can we recognize and close those gaps quicker with more agile processes? So I think, what we're trying to think through is very much in line with the survey, and also trying to understand the regulatory, legal, compliance environment. And, it's a lot of education. It's a lot of, really trying to map out and show, where, this is different, but it's still the same scientific exchange and interaction. We're just meeting the time that we're living in, which is a little bit different than, as I like to refer to, the flat Stanley. Those of you with kids, had mail flat Stanley around the world. How do we get to this three-dimensional discussion with our HCPs and not just show up with a bunch of slides?
Thank you, Mary. I remember the flat Stanley instance that you're talking about, so I know we're really pushing the envelope. Abhijit, did you want to provide a perspective on the global side? How are you seeing the field medical interaction happening?
Yeah, I think this is this is fascinating, right? This is like moving towards, and we'll talk about the multi-channel, because I think these are building blocks as we talk about it. How do we get the feedback and then tailor that content, right? And I know we have a specific discussion surrounding it, but I look at world as it's heavily driven by the regulatory and the compliance requirements, right? So I think what you can do in an interactive way in the US might look very different compared to what you can do in emerging markets, right? Where there are different regulations in terms of the sequence of how we can show certain things. So I think I look at it as this particular space, and as Maureen rightly mentioned, at least in the US, I think it's we are everybody's struggling with this in terms of how do we make sure that our legal and compliance colleagues are comfortable with that kind of an approach, where we are doing things out of the normal way of how typically that interaction occurs. But I look at it as something which is going to, over the next 3-4 years, where this is only going to grow. But where some of the challenges are is, the best way to do this in an interactive way is to really be able to navigate the technology, right? the medical affairs team is really from a content perspective, right? We don't know how some of these back-end things connect, and how do that magic happens. So it's for us, it's more content related, and that marriage, as you, Samir, mentioned at the beginning, at some organizations are having technology people sitting on some of these things. I mean, this is one area where we can't just say that, look, we had a roadmap of how medical affairs would function, right? We knew how MSLs would do. We knew what information they would get. How do we get those approved, and how do we do the communication? But here we are talking about really different territories, right? How does the back end of some of this really work to make that content, something which is really focused on a need of a particular physician in terms of where they want to go. It is customizable, and also collect data at the back end. Because in my mind, the data that you collect at the back end is going to be so crucial, whether we talk about websites, whether we talk about multi-channel, to really understand what are those needs of that physician, right? In terms of their learnings, or in terms of their curiosity or their interest. I think those are the things that we hope that we will collect out of it. So I think we conquered the first thing, right? We know that everybody's doing field medical interactions remotely because of the pandemic. So I think that is kind of check box, right? Now we want to move to that next level, which is how do we make sure that that content is interesting, is relevant for that particular HCP, and then how do we collect that data from that at the back end and make sure that we are able to analyze that data to ensure that we even do a better job of that content going forward. So it's a very dynamic space. I think it's going to be heavily driven, as we see, by regulations in different regions in terms of their their digital maturity, if you can call it, right? I mean, every as well as their compliance requirements. So those things are going to have a huge impact in terms of how this is going to play out.
Thank you, Abhijit. And actually, we'll hold the thought about data, because we'll pick that up again when we talk about omni-channel, multi-channel, right? Because the data is the cornerstone of that coming through. But Maureen, if I can have a rejoinder to you, and I'm looking at you because US typically is ahead of the world in terms of infrastructure, technology, and so on. So if you can also talk through the changes that we are seeing in field medical with concepts like virtual MSLs, right? And what's also happening perhaps on the customer side, how engaged are HCPs in these kind of interactions, if you can provide some insights from a US perspective?
Yeah, first I wanted to kind of follow up on something that we just said about capabilities. And I think, that who we're hiring into the capabilities is also very important. Just didn't want to lose that thought, because I think that's an important trend as well as we come through. As far as the virtual environment, this has really shifted how people, again, talking about capabilities and actually spanning generations. People used to doing a job in one way. It's very much, I go, I meet, I plan my day. I'm on the road Monday through Thursday. I have a home office day Friday, and I have these other events in between. And the shift, so rapidly didn't really give people an opportunity to say this is, different. It's like, it's what we have to do. And, we've definitely seen a shift in our customers, what they want. And now, as we're starting to come out, obviously everyone went remote and started the virtual interactions. Our customers are shifting what their expectations are. They're more comfortable with the virtual interaction. They prefer to be able to do it. And what's shifting is the times that they want to do it, right? We're used to trying to get in on their, talk to them during lunch or in between appointments. And now they're shifting where and when they want to engage. And that's really our challenge, is how do we meet the customer where and when they want? And those do break traditional operating models of the 9-to-5 office business. And I think as we are thinking through, at least in our company, it's like, how do we, as we implement our omni-channel strategy, how do we help, transition between what a typical MSL would do with research and, IRs and helping to educate, versus what is the HCP that is looking for a different type of engagement and interaction, and really trying to set up, how do we break down barriers to make it easy to get to that person live and have this type of discussion versus calling into a call center and then having to make an appointment. And those are some of the things we're thinking through right now. And hopefully that kind of answered some of the points that you were kind of trying to drill into.
No, absolutely it does, Maureen. And I'm just looking at the conscious of the clock. We'll move to the next capability. Before that, you guys also talked about the whole MLR piece, the content piece. And again, I'll pick up that thread when we talk about multi-channel, omni-channel, because all of those in that sense are all tied together, right? So let's talk about the next capability. This is around medical information, medical websites. And this is very interesting from my perspective is as the whole world, and I'm looking at us as lay consumers, all of us are moving to more and more of self-service mode, right? We don't want to pick up the phone. We want to go to the website. And as long as I am able to get to a chatbot when we do a financial transaction. In fact, when is the last time any of us visited a bank, right? Most of our stuff happens online or we go to an ATM. It's interesting how the dynamic is shifted on the medical information side as well. So perhaps, Kay, you can provide an overarching view once again of that capability, and then may Alice around the best practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was a situation where teams are really beginning to gain more traction, at least for those teams that we've interviewed. So 60% of the teams actually have in place a medical or medical information type website that they're actively managing. And 4 of the teams have plans to actually establish that self-service type methodology that Samir was referring to. Now, one thing that we did find very interesting as we looked at the data and we look at things like best practices, the DX score for this, which is the overall implementation of best practices for these companies that have implemented this capability, it was one of our lower DX scores at 43. And Mary Alice, maybe you want to kind of review with people what those DX scores represent in terms of, best practices that people had in place and maybe areas, again, for development.
Yes, so it is very interesting because on one hand, you have medical websites being a key area of focus, which makes sense because I think, building off of what Maureen and Abhijit said, this is really about meeting the customer where they are and what they want, so having a robust website that provides access to the information they want in the moment. So it's an aspiration for many. At the same time, to do it correctly, there are a lot of best practices. So this capability actually had 14 best practices. So when you think about it in terms of the DX score, there were, of the companies, the 9 companies who said, absolutely, we have a medical website. When you had to look deep into what good looks like across 14 best practices, there was still a lot of improvement that could be done there. So what I mean by that is, for some of the best practices, which were foundational, things like updating the website with new content on a regular basis, right? Making it really there to answer current questions, or having a regular process to continuously improve the website based on customer feedback, actively managing data privacy issues. Those were all, very consistently done and really set the foundation. I think that low DX score is really driven by some of the more challenging best practices. And some of those would be capturing instant customer feedback from each website visitor, making sure that you're concept testing and conducting market research with your target audience, right? Are we actually asking our healthcare providers what they want from us when they think about, I want to use a medical website? There are still even some of those stretch best practices included some easier things to do, such as, are you testing this website internally? Are you testing it with your field medical group and really getting that feedback? Say, is this content what you're engaging HCPs on out there? And then, utilizing overall various techniques to get feedback from end users. So a wide range of best practices and number 14 areas to really strive for improvement in. But I would very much agree with what Kay said. This is an area, medical websites, where many medical affairs teams are focusing now.
Awesome. Thank you, Alice. Before I pass it on to the panel members, I just want to encourage the audience to put in questions for us in your chat window. We are making sure we have about 10-15 minutes at the end, and we'll be happy to answer questions you may have. In this, for the medical information, medical websites, Abhijit, if you're okay, we'll start on the global side first. And for your perspective, because the digital infrastructure may not be as widespread as it is on the US side. So what's the lens you guys are taking from your perspective, and then what you are seeing happening in the market as well?
So I mean, clearly we are prioritizing depending on, which countries, which products, right? I mean, you can't have, and many of these have to be specific for certain countries. We can't have the same website that is here for something in other regions. So I think that is point number one, because this can multiply very quickly. If you're talking about 50 countries and then 10 products, it's 500, right? I think the bigger challenge, and this is beyond the globe that we're talking about. There's so much content out there, right? I mean, we want to make sure that we use content so that we don't have to recreate content for every country, and we can tailor make it or do some quick tweaks depending on what the needs are. There is a lot of content out there. I think the challenge, and we feel that this is you have a website, you have that box to contact the med info, etc. You're done. But how do you make sure that it's always going to be passive, right? It is for people, as you said, self-serve. They have to come there to have that engagement. And the good part of the website is that you can do a lot of analytics, right? You get views, you get how much time people have spent on a particular screenshot. There is things that we have learned from other industries which can very easily get applied here, right? But I think the bigger challenge is how do we make sure that content is, we are updating it, because if it's not going to be updated, and then you talk about so many countries and so many combinations, it's a Herculean task. I mean, so you have to prioritize. You have to make sure that it is interesting for the HCPs, number two, and of course some of the things that we're talking about in terms of making sure that you get feedback from the HCPs, or you get feedback from the MSLs. It's critical. I think the biggest challenge also is that sometimes the medical part of that website is kind of buried somewhere, right? I mean, if you look at most of the website, there is nothing. But usually there's commercial website, and then there is, for content, click this on the right side somewhere. So how do we make sure that we are able to really address that? I think if you talk to physicians, they are more interested to really get, learn more about the disease area, more about the latest concept. They're moved beyond that thing about talking about the product, right? So that is really where the opportunity is. But how do we make sure that they're able to go there? I think that is a constant conundrum that everybody has. And how do you, once they go there, how do you make sure that you have content which they are interested in? So that's really, it is a passive tool, because it is not something where you are actively engaging with, like in case of field medical interaction, where we may have that a little more. So this is really good, but we are looking at a global level in terms of prioritization. I mean, just to see where it is, what is the real need, which countries, how do we look at it?
Thank you, Abhijit. That's very helpful. And Maureen, I'm hoping it's a little bit easier in the US side of things, only one market to consider, one set of regulations.
Yes and no. So, it's very timely. We are designing right now our first full US medical affairs website. We've had a medical information connection site where people could access, but we're, a lot to what you just spoke about. We're really trying to say, what is it that HCPs are interested in? What are the gaps that as a company, we in medical affairs, we can help fill. And we actually, speaking Mary Alice, but we were talking about the best practices, we actually did quite a bit of market research. It starts with understanding who your customer is first for the website. And many times I think we're tempted to think the KOL is our customer in medical affairs. And, for a website, I feel very passionately, it's not the KOL. They have the connection. They know who to go to within the company. It's our other HCPs, our supportive staff that are helping, whether it's the home infusion nurse that's helping to administer our product in the home, or the nurse practitioner, physician assistant that's helping. So the first thing we had to really define is who's the primary customer for our website. And once we started to do that, and we did research on identifying those, and we actually sat down and asked them, what do you find valuable? They went through card sorts, they went through different trees, and really helped us clarify how can we help deliver what you need. And disease state information clearly was a gap area. So yes, we're providing product information in an appropriate way through medical information, but there's still this gap in disease state. The other thing they talked about is knowing the time relevance of the information. They really want to know that this is not static content that was put up 3 years ago. We talked about, do we actually put last updated so people have that confidence in the information? But I think lastly, we talk about the stickiness, because this is our first site. We get someone to come here. What makes it something that people feel that's valuable, that they'll come back and know that we're providing, information in an agile way to close those gaps. So those are all a lot of the build pieces that are a little bit different, I think, from trying to get it through the approval process. So, we have the ability to do a lot because we are a single, country and with uniform legislation and FDA rules. But it's really, I think, finding our customer and how to connect with them. And then how do we build this out for the future as this becomes part of our, this is one channel, right? As we move on to our omni-channel engagement.
Perfect, Maureen. This is very well said. And I'm going to pick up the threads from the two capabilities we talked about, right? There was data which Abhijit highlighted. Maureen, you've talked about how do you actually have dynamic content. At the end of the day, how do you keep customer in the center, which gets us to the third capability we want to talk about is multi-channel and omni-channel, right? So all of us have looked at multi-channel where it's all about tactics which go across various formats. But actually, where we really want to be is omni-channel, where we have customer at the center and we are able to provide a unified, personalized experience to that customer. And our commercial colleagues perhaps have taken the journey further ahead than on the medical side. But Mary Alice and I have seen that there's some companies have actually embarked on the medical affairs side fairly well on that omni-channel journey. So before we dive a bit deeper, perhaps Gabe, you once again can talk a little bit about the findings from the survey, and then Mary Alice on the best practices.
Yeah, well, and Samir, I would add to that. I mean, isn't it what we all strive for, that the company is seen as the primary source of key information on the individual product? And there are so many sources out there right now that people can turn to. Don't we want them to turn to the source that has the background data, has the regulatory requirements for presenting that data, so that people really get absolutely everything that they need in order to make those healthcare decisions? With omni-channel and multi-channel medical strategy, this was one of the capabilities where we had a much smaller number of individuals who were actively implementing this capability currently, with only 4 companies out of the 15 who had already enacted. However, this was the case that everyone else, the other 11 companies, said that they clearly have plans to implement a multi-channel or omni-channel strategy. For the companies that had already enacted this capability, their DX score was rather high at 50 in comparison to many of our other scores. So we know that they're performing very well at trying to deliver the best practices through the work that they're doing with this capability. And Mary Alice will review those best practices.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ken. I think you said a couple of really important things, as you did as well, Samir, earlier, that it's almost like omni-channel is the overall goal. Because omni-channel pulls together many of these other capabilities and looks at it as a coordinated strategy. So I think when you think about medical affairs teams being earlier in their journey, it probably makes sense that they have focused on some of the individual areas, perfecting some of those that are priorities within their company, but still working on how does it all come together, right? So how are we the coordinated interface delivering multiple options for the customer that the customer prioritizes, and how we have those options talking to each other, right? So it's seamless. And so I think it is an overall goal for many of the members of the Medical Affairs Digital Strategy Council. As Kay said, everyone has this on their list of what they want to do. A few have really started tackling it. So why is that? I think when you look at the best practices, it's challenging. I mean, for those who have tackled multi-channel / omni-channel, they're looking at what are the variety of tools, what are the software options, how do we measure effectiveness and impact? And I think important, how do we prioritize the various channels for content? So those, I think, are top of the list of best practices to tackle. Some of the best practices that I think are more challenging are things like mapping customers' communication preferences against the channels and interests. So really thinking about it from the customer and perspective and saying, well, which one would they choose and what do they want out of that channel? And then finally, I think which is really challenging, is aligning offline and online efforts. So really getting it to that next level so it feels like Amazon, when you can just really get the information you want, continue the conversation on any channel. So yeah, looking forward to hearing more about how this is in real life from Maureen and Abhijit.
Absolutely. And Maureen, if we can go first with you, because I remember in our initial chat, you were talking about how you were thinking of starting this journey, but perhaps some insights for the audience?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Mary Alice, that's exactly what we're looking for, is how do we, have this continuous 360-degree journey. It doesn't, wherever it starts and picks up again, it's this continuous loop. And, as and that's really multiple disciplinary within medical affairs, right? So it's how do we surface content and what are we making available? How do we segment our customers, our HCPs? Are there different channels even online for a KOL engagement versus your HCP engagement, different levels? And, how then does that change when they go to a Congress, or how when the MSL is interacting with them? And really what we've been trying to think about is this holistic universe that all those interactions take place on. So if the MSL is in the field or field medical, anyone is using this platform. We don't know what this platform is, but this platform that, we're all talking about the same content. And if it's an interactive MOA, that they start the journey looking at one piece in the field, that then they can come back on at night with a QR code and start right back up where they left off, or whatever the piece is. And if they have additional questions, getting them to the right place in a timely manner, or, just a deeper dive into, what they've already heard and, need more, or starting on the website, and then how do we deploy people to help them on their journey? And those are the exact questions that we're having right now. And how do we make that seamless? I think that's their, really the issue is making it seamless.
Thank you, Maureen. That's very insightful. Abhijit, what's your perspective on the global side?
So I think the interesting piece here is as I mentioned, the digital maturity is very important. We have seen that in certain markets there is a lot of data that is available that has historically been collected, which has allowed us. And if you look at our countries across the globe, we have almost like different levels, right? Where they're going to be much easier to adapt this kind of an integrated approach. Physicians where they're already transitioned into pretty much virtual world, right? If you look at most of the college going kids, they will do everything virtual. They don't want anything, no interaction, no touch points. They want everything that is coming out, right? And I think certain countries, they have a far higher digital maturity, especially in the Far East, where you're able to do a very, very, very tailored thing. There's a lot of data that comes in, and part of the issue here is getting the data, right? I think, as I said, when we even talked about the field medical interactions, the content, that in my mind is almost like that basis, right? What is the communication channel they prefer, right? Within the confines, right? I mean, you can have website, you can have emails, you can have some of these interactions that are there, and within that, what is the content that they want, right? So those are the two classic things that we can only understand based on data, and the more data that you generate. So right now, when we talk about field medical interactions, we were forced, pretty much everybody was forced to do it, right? 10 months or 15 months ago, it was almost like we were able to circumvent all the hurdles, whether it was regulatory, whether it was compliance. We found a way to get it done, and now that next level is that how do we get the data from that to really understand what those, because you don't want that whatever the MSL is inputting in terms of insights or anything to just sit there. You want to then take it and analyze it. You want to really look at trends. You want to look at what is the I mean, this is different in different countries almost, right? You have social listening that is happening, where people are talking about a particular product and about a certain interests that are there, and the social media listening is a huge impact. And how do we make sure we get those insights? So this is, in my mind, this is the holy grail as we're talking about it, because it's this place where everything comes together, and this is like, we want to make sure, and to earlier points, how do we make sure that people stay engaged? I mean, what is that touch point to make sure that we are constantly understanding their needs and providing with the content which is credible, which is compliant, and I think that is the biggest hurdle, or the biggest opportunity. I look at it both ways. It's kind of glass half full almost, but you'd want to look at it as an opportunity.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Abhijit. And folks, I'm just looking at the clock. What we did was, as a quick synopsis, right? We covered a quick overview of the 12 digital capabilities. We double-clicked on field medical. We talked about medical information, and how do we tie it all together from omni-channel perspective. In the few minutes that we have, perhaps we can take a few questions. And the first one I always get in any forum, and Alice, perhaps I'll let you respond first on that, and then have Maureen and Abhijit respond. What are the most common barriers challenging digital capabilities, and what are some of the best practices? And I'll go first, Alice, and these are some of the things we've heard folks always talk from a medical affairs side. One is resources, that we are always not having enough amount of money, right? Capabilities, and there have been interesting ways folks have solved for that, and also is in terms of skill set as well. But Alice, what could be the others, and how have others perhaps tackled these barriers?
Yeah, no, I agree with those too, Samir. And what I would add to it probably is where to begin. I think many teams, they know that there's a lot of transformation happening out there. There are almost so many opportunities. Where should I focus? What's the priority for my team? And I think that's almost an initial hurdle that holds people back, is thinking about, where do I begin? What should be the first place? The other one would be investment, I think. I mean, you said resources, I think, absolutely from a people perspective, and the right capabilities, but also from the financial perspective. And I think a key question many teams have to answer is, how will we proceed? And, medical affairs isn't an island, right? So how will we partner with our commercial digital team? how do we leverage their learning? How do we leverage their expertise? And I think what we've seen in the council, that many teams that move more quickly are probably the ones that are leveraging and partnering across the company.
Perfect. Thank you, Mayor. Maureen, did you want to chime in from your side?
I agree with everything that was said. I think, and we are partnering with our omni-channel engagement team. We actually have a dedicated medical person that's part of our OCE team that is really dedicated to helping us bring this to life. I think it's in addition, the mindset. I've been in pharma 20 years, and started with slide carousels that we used to make 35 millimeter slides. And I think sometimes we're a little biased about how our customers still want this one-on-one interaction, or our customers change over time, and we have to almost get out of our own way sometimes about what our perceived biases are about what our customer wants. And I think that's been one of our challenges, is just, but we've always done it this way, and how do we do it differently and feel comfortable with it? And the resourcing, I just want to just echo that, but the future resourcing, because so many of these projects in medical affairs get funded and then they stop, right? Because either there's not the resource behind it to keep it going, or the vision, the energy, or it's a perceived not great. So, we have to be okay with some failures in the beginning as we test and learn and grow and deliver and maintain the commitment longitudinally, not just as a one-time project.
That's very insightful. Thank you, Maureen. Abhijit, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think, of course, resources, the technology, and I think we talked about it. I think there's increasingly issues around privacy in certain markets, right? I mean, what can be said, what cannot, how much data can we collect? I mean, all those things that this is all at the end, in my mind, going to be determined by what analytics we can do at the back end, right? I mean, at that eventual goal, because that's really the head, right? If I want to say that this is the need, and I want to tailor a particular activity or message to ensure that I meet the scientific needs of a colleague, right? I need to really understand that, and the only way you can get it is, through some of these analytics, and there are definitely barriers to that. We also need to bring the enabling functions, when we talk about it, compliance, legal, primarily, at that same level of maturity in terms of where we want to go, because that can be a huge challenge, right? Because it is like we have done that, right? We have ran that race to some extent, but if they are not coming along, that can be a huge drag in terms of it. And I think some of these areas, even they are trying to kind of grapple with, right? There are lots of, this thing has exploded in the last, 18 months, 24 months, whatever you want to call it. And I think everybody's trying to, so resources are not just from our perspective. I think the enabling function to get them at par, their, upskillment or their understanding of what can be done, or giving us those, sandboxes or swim lanes, as I call them, in terms of what can be done in a compliant way, I think is going to be extremely critical to make sure that we really utilize some of these things.
Thank you, Abhijit. We are almost at the end. It's been a fantastic discussion. I want to thank each one of you for the time, for the partnership. And as a closing, I want to echo a comment Maureen and I exchanged in the prep. Right? We believe that the word digital is the second most often misused word. The most often misused word is strategy. And you combine the two together, digital strategy, right? So there's an inherent bias to action and a huge need to execute. But it's very, very important that we keep the center and the focus on the customer, because at the end of the day, we are doing everything for the customer, right? So it's important to be really, really customer-centric. So thank you so much for your time, folks, and everybody in the audience. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion as well. That's a wrap. Thank you.